KJV, NIV, NLT, TPT. What is with all these Bible translations? What's the difference between them, and which one should you be reading? Well, grab a cuppa and let's chat. Those of us who speak English are blessed to have access to so many different translations of the Bible. The original Old Testament was written in Hebrew with a little bit of Aramaic, and the New Testament were written in Greek. So the thing is, the purpose behind any translation was to take the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek and to translate them into whatever the native language is, for us, English. And because the English language keeps evolving with the different word meanings and the way that just our phrasing and idioms and those kinds of things, they change through the generations. And so that means that some of those early translations can feel a little stiff or archaic today in the 21st century, because we don't talk that way anymore. There are words that they used when the King James Version was written that don't mean the same thing to us today, or phrasing that it doesn't mean anything to us because it's from a different culture, a different time. And so that's why we keep having new translations come out, because they're trying to keep up with contemporary language, or in other words, they're trying to make sure that we have translations of the Bible that make sense to us in our modern language. That keeps changing. One thing to know is that no translation is 100% accurate. And that's because there are some words, ideas, and cultural references, they just don't have an exact equivalent in English, in our language. So let's talk about the three kinds of translations. There's a formal equivalent, a functional equivalent, and a dynamic equivalent. And so in a formal equivalent, you may also hear that called a literal translation or a word-for-word translation. And the idea there is that they're trying to, in the translations, these are going to be like the King James, the New King James, interlinear version. The goal there was that they made every word match. So if you took a sentence and you put it in the original Hebrew and then the exact same sentence and put it in English underneath, the idea is that if there's a thee here, there's a thee here. If there's a house here, then whatever the equivalent to house is here. And so that's another reason why it's actually impossible to have a perfect 100% accurate Bible, because some words just don't translate. But the idea behind a formal equivalent, also called the literal translation or the word-for-word Bible, is that they're keeping the original words intact, word for word. Some examples of the formal equivalents, and I've already kind of mentioned a couple: King James, New King James, the English Standard Version, the NASB, I can't remember what the N stands for, the Amplified also. One of the things I love about the Amplified is it gives you variations. So it's going to have word for word, but then it could also be this word or another expansion of the word, so that it takes a little longer, and it's a difficult version to read through. If you're trying to read the Bible straight through, it can be a little bit difficult, but it's great for study and for understanding. A functional equivalent can also be called paraphrase or a thought-for-thought translation. And so if you think about the three different types of translations being placed on a spectrum, like a line, a scale, the formal equivalent, which we just talked about, would be on one far side, whether it's the right or the left. It would be on one far side, that formal word-for-word translation. The functional equivalent that we're about to talk about would be on the opposite end. So over here we have the formal equivalent, the word-for-word translation. On the other end of the spectrum, we would have the functional equivalent, again, paraphrase or thought for thought. So the goal with those translations is to maintain the thought. So acknowledging that we don't have 100% accuracy in word for word, or acknowledging that we don't necessarily have an exact equivalent for every single word in the Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic to translate over to our English language, then their goal is acknowledging that and holding as close to that as they can while still holding the thoughts, maintaining the idea or the concept behind the scripture. So these are the translations that are generally considered more readable because these are the translations that continue to evolve with our language. And so the goal is to hold on to the thought and the idea of the passage while still making it more understandable. The reason they're more understandable is because they take the ancient idioms or cultural references and they put them into more of a modern language, something that we can identify with and understand a little bit better. But because their focus is more on the thought for thought, the ideas and the concepts, there are concerns about them losing even more accuracy or there being more errors because they're holding to thoughts instead of word for word. A few examples of functional equivalents or thought for thought equivalents translations would be the Message, the Living Bible, some of those others that are more paraphrase-like. So we've talked about the formal equivalent at one end of the spectrum and the functional equivalent at the other end of the spectrum. So in the middle, we have that third type of translation, which is called the dynamic translation, also called a mediating translation. And so as you can imagine, the goal there is that they're holding as closely as they can to the word for word translation so that they keep that intact while still doing their best to make it a little bit more readable. So you won't see the these and the thous and the more archaic language that we would see like in a King James or a New King James Version or one of the interlineals, one of the older versions where they really hold to that sort of more of the archaic, the ancient language, the these and the thous and the real formal type of language. The dynamic translations, while they're trying to bring the best of both worlds together, the formal equivalent and the functional equivalent, they're bringing the word for word and the thought for thought together, and they're doing the best that they can to kind of merge those two or mediate. Some will lean a little bit more on the functional equivalent side, and some will lean a little bit more on the formal equivalent side. Some examples of dynamic equivalents would be like the New International Version, the the HCSB version, and the NAB. So those would be kind of somewhere in the middle of the spectrum in the different translations. So with hundreds of translations in our English language, which one should you be reading? Well, as you can imagine, there are lots of controversies and theological, doctrinal concerns over, one kind or the other. We're not going to address that in this video, and I'm not going to lean you towards one or the other because I think that that's a personal choice. But what I would tell you is that if you have some concerns about one translation or another, then talk to your pastor or someone else, a Christian that you really trust and whose opinion and wisdom that you trust. And then it's going to be ultimately between you and God to decide about translations. If you're of one of the denominations that believes only this one version, then I'm not trying to dissuade you or convince you to try one of the other translations. My goal with this video is just to explain what the differences are between the translations and kind of why we have so many. But aside from that, I would tend to agree with what my friend Jean says, is that the right Bible to read is the one that you will actually read. In general, the formal translations are great for study, for really digging in and reading the scripture and kind of the research mode, those kinds of things. Generally, more of the formal translations. So New King James, interlinear, kind of moving towards the NIV area of the spectrum. A functional translation is really great for deeper understanding of the words or the phrases, and actually forming more of a heart connection with the scripture. And then the dynamic translation, obviously, then is just a really good middle ground of both. And again, that's sort of the NIV kind of area. So what I want to do next is just let you see what that looks like. We're going to take a look at a few examples of the same verse in different translations. So we're going to look at Psalm 119, verse 130. And we're going to take a look at the King James Version and the Amplified Version, which tend to be more on the formal equivalent side, or the word for word. We're going to look at the NIV, which is in the middle, the dynamic translation. And then we're going to look at the Passion Translation, which is more on the functional equivalent side. King James, the entrance of thy words giveth light. It giveth understanding unto the simple. In the Amplified, and remember, in the Amplified, they're really good about expanding and giving more words to give depth of understanding. So here it is in the Amplified. The unfolding of your glorious word give light. Their unfolding gives understanding to the simple, childlike. And in the NIV, the unfolding of your word gives light. It gives understanding to the simple. And so that one's really close to the King James, except they took the thys and the giveths out. And in the last one, we're looking at the Passion Translation. Break open your word within me until revelation light shines out. Those with open hearts are given insight into your plans. And so you can kind of see where in the King James it says the entrance of, and in the other two versions it said the unfolding of your words. In the Passion Translation, it's break open your word within me until revelation light, where they said gives light to, until revelation light shines out. Now here's one of the things that kind of clicked for me, where King James says he gives understanding to the simple, and Amplified said simple or childlike, and then New International Version also said simple. In the Passion Translation, it says those with open hearts. That's their translation for simple, open hearts. And so if you think of a child, they tend to be more open-hearted. They haven't already made up their minds about things. And so those who are open-hearted or childlike or simple, you give insight into your plans. So that's just an example of just seeing those four translations and how differently they can look, even though they're holding the same ideas and thoughts. It's just a different way of saying them. So which translation should you be reading? Well, that's your decision. That is completely up to you to decide, but hopefully now you at least understand kind of what the differences are between the Bibles, and kind of why there are so many translations, and kind of what that spectrum of the different kinds of translations that we have. So I've created a couple of reference guides to go along with this session, and if you'd like to get a hold of those, they're free, and I'll drop the link below for you to grab those. So next up, we're going to be talking about the major themes in the Bible. The major themes of the Old Testament, of the New Testament, and of the different sections of the Bible. And as always, if you're finding this information helpful and you want to hang around, make sure to click subscribe wherever that is. Subscribe means that when you go to YouTube, our content will show up for you easily. And then the little bell thingy is notifications, and that means that anytime we drop a new video, that YouTube will send you an email saying, hey, they've put out a new video. And if you want to stay connected with us in other ways, the links will be below, but we have a Facebook community and a Facebook page. I'm on Instagram. All the places you'll find us at Beneath the Fig Tree. And we have a website, blog, and Fig Tree Shop.